All right, so let's discuss the conservative case for white privilege. Now, white privilege is...
Do you want some? Is that what you're...
well,
You want
yes,
some?
I am dressed somewhat like a purveyor, a salesman of the white privilege. Hello there, gentlemen. Would you like some white privilege?
How much?
What you offering?
Are you literally like, what have you got?
What you got? Go on, then.
You've got some string?
You
I'll
got
take
some nice keys here.
Those are my keys.
They for your house?
Maybe.
I'll take those.
All right.
You want to be... You're Irish. You're Irish. You want to be white, don't you?
The house is a crap hole, so don't worry.
Oh.
It's not a house, flat. So.
Well, I can get some money for it.
I don't own it.
Well, I might.
Should we get back to white privilege?
Yes. White privilege is, of course...
robbing me.
Live robbery caught on air. White privilege is, of course, utter nonsense. It is a leftist term used to describe the fact that in countries that are majority white, you tend to find that white people do well and that white people occupy many positions of power. Maybe not representative to the proportion of white people who are in the country, because oftentimes nowadays it is far less than the actual proportion of white people who are in a country that actually occupy particular positions due to things like affirmative action, which thankfully the Supreme Court in America seemed to have struck down recently. In the UK, we're still blighted by such things thanks to the Equality Act and other such pieces of legislation. But it amuses me because we all know that it's nonsense. We all know that it's rubbish. But there is a certain type of conservative and a certain type of liberal ally to the conservative who are always more than happy to carry water for leftist concepts and more than happy to make an excuse, make a conservative argument for such things. I've seen many articles, often by David French. Let's be fair, if you've ever encountered him.
Cringe is...
He's a National Review conservative, shall we say. And he has written many articles on the defense of trans rights, the defense of trans kids, the defense of the conservative argument for gay marriage, all of these different things. And I think it's important to point out when this happens, call these people out and make people aware, because I just find it very amusing that the right, sadly, has in the past been rather poor at choosing allies. Now, completely unrelated.
Here's a video of me disliking James Lindsay.
No. I'm making a cogent argument against some of James Lindsay's conceptions of liberalism and his propensity to punch right against those within right-wing spheres who would have arguments about how to solve the current political crisis and culture crisis that we find ourselves in. This was a Rumble exclusive live hangout, which means you don't have to be a member of the website to watch, so you can please go over to Rumble and watch that for free. It was me and Connor discussing this, and I think we were very fair to James Lindsay. I'm not just trying to badmouth him, and I also was using this as a bit of a touchstone to be able to kick off a broader discussion about liberalism in general. And I thought that it was a very interesting and productive conversation that Connor and I had. So please, if you're interested, go over and watch that video. You might be able to learn something from it. Or if you feel that Connor and I went wrong somewhere, you can feel free to leave a comment, and I will be checking the comments. I've been enjoying interacting with people down there before. So David French, I mentioned, he is the kind of slippery slope conservative who can go from writing articles like this back in 2017, which was the racial poison of white privilege, which sadly does give a little bit of ground to the position in the article, but not as badly as some of his later ones. So for instance, we've got the name alone, which was probably decided by an editor, but still says the racial poison of white privilege, which suggests, that it's a term that's used more than anything as a cudgel to bludgeon people, with, unless as an actual argument, if you're trying to get a racially harmonious society, which is a very, very difficult thing to do, then you don't want to have these terms that provoke grievances that may or may not exist, or certainly make those grievances worse. Still, in this article, he states, and this is back from 2017, the discussion of white privilege has gone from interesting and thoughtful. It never was.
What do you mean thought?
It never was. To stupid and malicious at the speed of social justice, which is another absurd analogy to point that.
What even is that sentence?
Yes, that doesn't really make much sense. There is a fascinating debate to be held about the nature of privilege in America, including who has real privilege and how it shapes our nation, but we're definitely not having it, which is, shall we say, a slightly more nuanced take than he had back in 2021 when he wrote this article for The Dispatch called Structural Racism Isn't Wokeness, It's Reality. So here we can see somebody going down that slippery slope And let's read a few from this. So he's talking about Christians. They must not deny the full consequences of centuries of intentional racist harm. Residential segregation through redlining and other means. All you need to do is watch your average actual Justice Warrior video to have good arguments about what redlining actually was and how it actually affected people, or just read any article or book from Thomas Sowell to understand that these practices were not good and they were not just, certainly, but they did not harm black populations in the same way that certain people would like you to believe. And carry on, especially when combined with profound employment discrimination and educational disparities, resulted in the creation of large communities of dramatically disadvantaged Americans, which this is a supposed conservative and this is leftist rhetoric, as far as I'm concerned. Now for a note about conservatism. Are you ready for everybody's favorite definition of conservatism they've ever read in here? So, now for a note about conservatism. I simply don't grant that the dissenter's objections to Platt, who's the person he's responding to here, are conservative. Right wing, yes. Conservative, I object. Now, the other day I made a point on Twitter that conservatism can tend to be the ideology of yesterday's leftism. And this is certainly a good example of that, as far as I'm concerned. Years ago, my friend Rod Dreher wrote that the business of conservatism with integrity is not to impose an idealistic ideological narrative on reality, but rather to try and see the world as it is and respond to its challenges within the limits of what we know about human nature. Problem with this definition, of course, being that who is determining what the world is at any given time, and how are you going to respond to those challenges? And it seems to me that these kinds of conservatives are completely useless and will just allow the left to define what the world is at any particular time. So you just go along with the left's conception of it, and then you just go, as Michael Malice would say, conservatism is progressivism going the speed limit. You go, okay, the world is terrible, and I agree with all of your absurd conceptions of how everything is, but let's not get radical about how we solve it. We don't want complete race communism yet. What we want is mild race communism. We just want a sprinkle of race communism.
And then question mark, question mark, question mark. We defeat the left. Trust me.
Yes, it's very strange. It's very absurd. But once again, I think that in here there is a tacit admission when he says that the people who disagree with him are right wing but not conservative. That conservative does not necessarily have to be right wing in nature. And once again, this doesn't lead to justice. And if you're actually asking me for my conception of how the politics works these days, you're just furthering the claims of leftist grievances that go towards leftist clients. Politics works as a client game, a voting game. You get people to vote for you by promising them benefits. That's how democracy works. And so if you have big blocks of people with racial grievances, you stoke those racial grievances, and then you go, I will give you big bits of money in return for your votes because you have racial grievances. So he's just legitimizing this. And this is something that tends to happen quite a lot. And we've got articles just showing that this is very much a leftist phenomenon when it comes to the idea of white privilege. Forbes Anti-Racism 101. But if we just check the URL here, we can see what was the original title of this article. Dear white people. You know a statement's going to be excellent when it begins with "Dear white people,"
Wasn't there
don't
a
you?
show called that on Netflix?
Yes, there was.
Was also Cancer. Just completely unwatchable.
Once again, any statement that begins with "Dear white people," I just shut. It's white noise to me. Audible white noise. I mean, please go away. And it's leftist propaganda, as you can imagine. We've got loads of articles about it constantly. This one from May this year. Yellowface takes white privilege to a sinister level. This article is about this book, Yellowface. If you've walked into a Waterstones recently, you'll have seen it. You'll have seen it because it's on all of the shelves, and it's essentially fan fiction to try and prove that a real-life phenomena exists. Now, this is a description of it. In a climate where the publishing industry is being highly scrutinized for its gatekeeping, unfair treatment of marginalized writers and editors, its role in appropriation, and more, Kwang's novel is a strong commentary on the exploitation and rigors writers face under the pressure to be successful. Yellowface is about a young white author who steals the manuscript of her dead Asian friend, finishes it, and publishes it as her own. The beauty and irony of this conversation is that Kwang herself is an Asian writer, telling this story through the eyes of a white writer. Fan fiction, racial fan fiction to try and stoke up grievances. I am an Asian person who has written a story about how white people steal the work of Asian people for profit. Okay, what does that prove then? That you have some kind of schizophrenic paranoid delusion. And Salon, everyone's favorite. we've all had a good look through Salon at the time. Do you remember that article from a few years ago from Salon that said that actually Mao and Stalin were right wing because left wing is when government doesn't be totalitarian and right wing is when government is totalitarian? That
Yeah,
was
it
a
was very
fun
big
one.
brain.
It was enormous brain. That was Giga Chad brain right there.
Why the right is so terrified of woke? There are truths that we just can't face.
Conservatives didn't want to hear about white privilege, so they abandoned reality and joined the Orange Man's cult. This one has some funny moments in it where they just show that leftists only view the world through a paranoid, schizophrenic lens given to them by films and television media. They say so many things in our society can be understood by thinking back to high school. Think of nearly Edward, because these people haven't bypassed the emotional or grown past the emotional maturity of a high schooler.
I don't know. You're right there. Sorry. Think back to high school. Now think of a Hollywood film about high school.
Yes.
So not actually a high school experience. Get rid of that out of your brain.
No, just think of a Hollywood film about suburban teenagers in which the good-looking, spoiled brats of the country club get their comeuppance in the third act after reveling in all sorts of bad behavior. I'm sorry.
But that didn't happen. You literally just said that don't think of your actual high school, think of a movie.
It's very...
Think of something that didn't happen and then base your view on that.
It is very amusing and very strange because I don't know if this person knows this, but Hollywood films, they don't just sprout out of the ground. They are written by people, often people who have life experiences of their own, often people who were bullied nerds in high school, or not even bullied nerds, just isolated losers with no friends. Spiteful mutants, I believe is the term that's used for them, where they write weird fan fictions about how all of their high school people that they didn't like, all of their fellow students in high school who they hated, actually were all horrible people and deserved to die. This is what, and then other leftists watch this and go, oh my God, this is just like when I was in high school. I have an understanding of reality. But once again, all of this is just to show that leftism is where the idea of white privilege comes from in the first place, and it should not be adopted by the right, which is why it's very, very frustrating when right-wingers or conservatives continually fall into this trap of trying to use the left's terms against it, as if pointing out hypocrisy, which we've been doing for bloody decades at this point, is going to actually solve anything. Hate to break it to you, if the left are hypocrites, the left don't care. The left go, huh, funny that, isn't it? And then continue to try and destroy your culture. They don't care. They're not going to look in the mirror or reflect for a moment. They are going to carry on as they always do, which is why it's frustrating when I see accounts like this, Cattered, which are quite an amusing account for the most part, mostly posts memes, posted this picture of Hunter Biden, which is in the aftermath of the recent the recent court hearings and everything that's been going on that's shown that he's actually been party to a lot of corruption, things that we all already knew for a very long time, and he's getting very little in the way of backlash against it. Connor and I went through it the other week. I've forgotten the exact details of it, but I know that he's certainly not getting the book thrown at him. Let's just say that. With this comment, the face of above the law and white privilege. Above the law?
Yeah.
Yes. Where does the white privilege come into it?
His last name's Biden.
Yeah, it's because he's from the Biden dynasty. That's why this is. And it's very frustrating to me when I see this, because to be fair, Cattered, for the most part, is a somewhat satirical, funny account, as you can tell from the name.
I just love how you're trying to make it work, like Shadid. You know about Shadid?
No, tell me about Shadid.
So Shadid was a black lady's dog that she wanted buried.
All right, okay.
Actually, no, I've got them mixed up now. No, there were two Shadids. There was
okay, there was Shadid 1 and 2.
There was Shadid 1.
Are we talking about a number 2 right here?
The Shadid was the dog that wanted to be buried, and the cemetery wouldn't put Shadid's name on the headstone because it spelled something rude.
All right.
And then Shadid was a black woman who also made a song about herself. I don't know why her parents called her Shadid, but they did.
You know.
And it was terrible. But I love how you're like, yeah, Cattered. It's a French name.
I'm trying desperately not to just say cat turd, but there you go. This is a relatively memey account, so it's probably just a joke. Probably just a joke. That's fine. 27,000 likes. Hopefully they all understood that it was a joke. Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the other hand, as far as I'm aware, not a meme account, responds to this tweet from Henry Rogers saying, Kodak Black's lawyer reacts to the Hunter Biden news, said Kodak was charged for the same crime and had to serve 3 years in jail for it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, unfortunately, Kodak's daddy was not president. Fair point. Yeah, if your dad's the president of the United States, you're probably going to get away with a lot more things than the average person is. And he's not white. For God's sake. For God's sake, Marjorie, why? Do not use their framing. You are legitimizing their framing. I went through to try and find this tweet and found a lot of tweets of people accusing you of having white privilege. Do not legitimize the claim in the first place. It's very, very silly and very disappointing. And then the Spectator did it as well. The Spectator did it as well. The media does not want to address racial disparity when it comes to Hunter Biden. He is a clear-cut example of the kind of white privilege that motivated hundreds of think pieces on race. And now they don't want to touch it? It's like the left are hypocrites and don't care. What a shock. What a big surprise. Furthermore in the article, they have more in here. So they say racial conflict has driven much of the political and media conversation, leading to the widespread concept of DEI in boardrooms and newsrooms, and the Democratic Party employing a vague concept of racial equity in the place of equality. Yet suddenly, all of that has gone out the window when it comes to Hunter Biden, the affluent and powerful white son of the sitting president of the United States. They don't care. They don't care. You are their political enemy, and Biden, whether or not it's Joe Biden or Hunter Biden, is a useful political tool for them because he is their friend, politically speaking. So if he experiences white privilege or what appears to be white privilege from their own terms, they don't care. Would you care?
No.
Exactly. Why would they care if it means they're winning? Either way, they get what they want. And then furthermore, I just wanted to point out that there are others that kind of go down a slippery slope. Although, to be fair, these people that I'm going to call out are difficult to describe as right-wing or conservative in the first place, but they are people who the right has aligned with that have some issues about them, some trouble about them, and when certain things come out, they show their true colours. Like the situation that we've got in France at the moment, where people are rioting in the streets, and it seems to be one particular type of person who is going out in the streets and destroying France and rioting and such. And, anybody who cares about the West, anybody who cares about Europe, anybody who cares about France goes, that's a terrible thing. I hate to see that. I hope somebody can step in and stop that soon. And then you get Ian Miles Chong come out, who, if you remember, is somebody who can occasionally provide useful information and has kind of been in the ear of Elon Musk for a while. He puts himself forward as a free speech kind of guy, then comes out and says, if you're proud that Europeans conquered and subjugated other people, then you should be perfectly fine with the same thing happening to France right now. They're being conquered and they're surrendering without a fight. That's how it works. But for real though, why doesn't anyone ask why so many Middle Easterners and Africans are fleeing to Europe? Could America bombing the F out of their countries with drones of diversity and tolerance and making them uninhabitable have something to do with the refugee crisis? Is this the right thing to say in this circumstance? I understand that, yes, there are problems going on in Africa and the Middle East.
There aren't.
Well, there can be, but there aren't. So this is just nonsense. You are right.
I'm just sick of this assumption we have in the West of the rest of the world's uninhabitable. No, it's perfectly habitable.
They didn't.
The reason they come to Europe, and I'm going to be charitable and say is being somewhat ironic in the sense of I can understand being conquered because you refuse to actually fight back. And that is correct. If we just enforced our borders, we wouldn't be conquered. It's that simple.
Well, this is all true, but I have to point out as well that it's probably not the average Frenchman on the street refusing to fight back. It's not me refusing to fight back in England. It is the states. They're the ones enforcing this, and they're the ones creating a political situation, a domestic situation in your country, where if you do anything about it, if you say anything about it, you are liable to get the book thrown at you legally. That is why lots of people don't do it, because they have been put into a situation where they can't. We're not allowed to talk about certain things on YouTube and on Twitter. Ironically, given the free speech platform that was supposed to be Twitter, we're not allowed to talk about certain things or say certain things because we will get the book thrown at us, we will get our platforms taken down, and then we won't be able to talk about other things. That is what makes us not be able to talk about these things. Not because I don't think about these things, not because I don't care about these things, not because I'm not willing to fight these things, but because there is top-down pressure creating a situation where you can't do anything about it. Similarly, Carl had a discussion with this man, Michael Tracy, who I don't want to write off entirely. I've been looking into some of the things that he does, and he's been doing a lot of good work looking at the situation in Ukraine, questioning some of the narratives that are going on around there, and he has done a few other bits of journalism in the past. But once again, we need to be careful about the sorts of people that we ally ourselves with, because a lot of the time, because we have one narrow focus at any one time, at a bit of the culture war, we ally ourselves with particular people who then turn around and reveal themselves to have nothing else in common with us. So Michael Tracy, who once again I don't want to write off, and Carl has been having some diplomatic conversations with him over the course of the past few days regarding some of the statements that he's made. But he did put this in response to this footage of France, saying that it's so stupid to look at a bunch of teenagers acting crazy in the summer. Just average white boy summer. Right here, this is what me and the boys are going to do for spring break, I think.
I just love that meme of like, man, there could be teenagers around here. I hate teenagers.
As the wind caressed his cool, bare chest. Yeah, it's so stupid to look at a bunch of teenagers acting crazy in the summer and ascribe some cogent ideological or religious motive. I seriously doubt that any of these kids would cite radical Islam to explain their behavior. By the way, this library wasn't burnt down and is reopening next week. If that bit at the end is true, that's good to know. I'm very glad to know. And he carries on down here. As you may remember, there were similarly arson-fueled riots in the US in 2020, and they had nothing to do with radical Islam.
No, they had to do with black nationalism.
Yeah, they had to do with racial grievances, Michael, because yes, this person specifically labels Islamist radicals.
But that's shorthand. We use it as shorthand in Europe for basically the Muslims, as in those from North Africa and the Middle East. It's not because we're like, oh man, they're all Salafist jihadists. So no, it's just shorthand to explain who they are.
Yes, he carries on as well. If you see a French Algerian teen was shot dead in the face in point blank range, which once again, having looked into it, that whole situation seems to me a lot like that wouldn't have happened to the guy if he had just complied with the police, as is so often the case in situations like this. And also, he was a drug dealer and a criminal who had been stopped numerous times for driving violations before. He was shot in the face at point blank range, and then another bunch of other teams start rioting afterwards. It's not just teens, it's a lot of people who are migrant populations who just come over. And
all they have in common is they're teens.
Yeah, that's the only thing in common. And I've not seen any footage of any of these people saying that the West belongs to the Middle East now, the West belongs to Islam now.
There's a bunch of French teenagers who are all there with their berets and baguettes being like, ha ha ha, France belongs to us now. What do you mean? It wouldn't make any sense. It already did.
It doesn't make any sense, does it? And but your immediate assumption...
This is for colonialism, France.
In France.
Put it down. French Revolution 2.0. Here we go, baby. This is revenge. I mean, maybe in 20 years when the French actually do have to rise up, but that's
yeah. But the immediate assumption is that the main explanation has to be radical Islam. You're just a dummy. But once again, this was about racial grievances, and this that's happening in France right now is about racial grievances, not about radical Islam necessarily, other than what, as Callum said, was a shorthand.
I think it's just a distance thing.
Possibly,
not
but
close enough to understanding the French context.
Well, he's been speaking to Carl about this, and he did also say that he'd been over to Paris. I don't know how recently, but he'd spoken to a lot of these French Algerians, and they were all just normal people. They're just normal people.
All people are people.
All people are people. Yes, if you speak to somebody one-on-one, but if you get them in a critical mass and set the fuse alight, then something like this can happen when you have an ethnically different population that has its own racial grievances. Because what I've seen a lot of these people saying is that this is essentially revenge for French colonialism in Algeria.
Well, they wrote it on the Holocaust Memorial. Did you not see that?
Oh, yes, they did, didn't they?
Yeah.
Very strange.
I mean, you couldn't be more blunt about it.
Michael Tracy's sitting at the side going, oh, those crazy teens. It's crazy what the heat does to them in the summer, isn't it?
French teens hate Jews. Not any other kind of teens, just French teens.
I'm wearing my nice clothes. Can you not?
Yeah, there's no correlation of certain people who hate Jews. No, it's just French teens. You do a map of people who hate Jews. Everywhere else love the Jews. French teens.
I know. The funny thing is that even Ian Miles Chong's statement suggests that it's due to revenge for the Algerian colonialism.
That's because it's their stated reason.
Yeah, that is their stated reason. He's calling it up saying that, there's a contradiction here, whereas Michael Tracy is just going, them kids. So, yes, we can have allies of convenience and friends on particular subjects, but I do think it's important to be aware of who your allies are, because then all of a sudden, you agree with them on particular foreign policy, you agree with them on free speech issues, you agree with them on maybe trans issues and such, but then all of a sudden a situation like this arises where you literally have chaos in the streets due to racial grievance, due to mass migration, and they turn around and start making excuses for it. So I just want to say, let's all be careful of that in the future.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Contemplation series, this episode on order and chaos. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.